of the 3-part series of this podcast episode series, all about reinventing your relationship with time. And I'm adding money into this final episode, because there is a direct correlation with our relationship with time and money in my experience. So we'll talk about this, and I'm not suggesting this is an episode where you're going to learn really specific investment tactics, or we're going to talk about investing or that type of thing. We have other podcasts for that. Absolutely. That's a huge part of what we talk about. And yes, there are tactics in this episode that you may find are super helpful for saving money or being able to increase your earning potential. But that's not necessarily what this is about in terms of, investment advice or anything like that. So let me just kind of level set there. As we look back at the last 2 episodes of this series, the concept of bandwidth versus capacity, bandwidth being finite, 24 hours in a day, capacity is infinite, what we're uniquely qualified to do. It's very important to make sure that we have that concept nailed and understood as we venture into looking at the correlation between time and money. So that relationship is direct. There's a direct impact. When we revisit and reinvent our relationship with time, it already impacts our earning potential, and it hopefully will impact our relationship with money. But here are some specific things that you can think about when you're looking at that bandwidth versus capacity. So if you've watched or listened to the last 2 podcast episodes, what we know is that our earning potential is when we are increasing our capacity. It's up here. It's not when we're trying to do too much, especially the things that we're not uniquely qualified to do, right, at bandwidth. So the more we can increase our capacity and expand it and manage and optimize our bandwidth, the better, right? Sometimes that means spending money to create more time. So there are ways to manipulate your bandwidth, of course, by spending against certain things that you are doing that you don't necessarily want to do, need to do, are qualified to do, or it makes sense to do because you could be earning more if you were spending your time and energy up here. So really kind of think about that. Sometimes it makes more sense to spend money to create more time versus work, create or use a lot more time to work in order to create more money. So they can kind of be manipulated and looked at differently in that way. So, we talk about, I'm sure you've heard before, we want to diversify our portfolio. We want multiple streams of income if we can, of revenue lines, of ways to generate money and have our money working for us. So diversification is great when it comes to investing and when we look at the financial side of things. However, diversification when it comes to our time isn't necessarily the same, right? The more things that we have going on, likely the less focus, which means we're focused on increasing our bandwidth or tapping, using more bandwidth, versus capacity. So focus is kind of an inverse of what you usually look at as some of the principles for investing your money. We want to invest our time in very specific areas and make sure we're not tapping ourselves and trapping ourselves and trapping our earning potential because we're so tapped at bandwidth. Okay, so just kind of think of that as just because it's true in an investment portfolio doesn't mean that's how we would treat our time. Okay, so I mentioned our earning potential is up here. In my experience, the higher I fly, the more I earn. But I need to optimize and manage my bandwidth in order to fly higher. So one of the things you can do immediately is gain confidence. And what I mean about that is confidence around money, confidence around your perceived control of your own money, how it's being spent, how it's being earned, and what influence you have over it. And so that's, again, making friends with reality. with the data and having a budget. This is not a new, crazy concept that I'm inventing here, of course, and hopefully you already have one. But what I know from personal experience and listening to a lot of friends and individuals who have, you start your career, you get going, you start making money, and the more you start generating, the more kind of relaxed you feel about keeping a really close eye on it. So maybe you're looking during tax period and you're making some adjustments there, but are you really checking in? Do you really know where you're spending, where things are going, where things could be optimized? Maybe not. So regardless if you're living, in a really thin, like lean margin, paycheck to paycheck, or you've got more money than you need, either way, you still have the ability to save and invest more and potentially even decrease your amount of stress based on those two factors and live differently and at higher capacity based on your perceived control too. So there's always room for improvement, regardless of what is in your bank account, right? So when I think of earning potential, what we're uniquely qualified to do, hopefully, is where you're able to make the most money. And a lot of factors are involved, and I don't want to have just a blanket universal saying when it comes to that. But in my experience, if you're finding that value prop that there's a scarce amount, right? And you are really good at it, and you have your market, you have people who are willing to spend against that, that's your earning potential, and that's where you want to be, versus doing the things that potentially everybody else can be doing and trading time for dollars. So what I look at is we talked about our time budget in the very first episode and into the second. We want to allocate our time where our earning potential is, ideally. So when I talked about that deep work, those things I'm uniquely qualified to do, there's a big allocation of that in my time budget. And you know what? There's a direct correlation, of course, hopefully, to my income and to my financial personal budget and even business budgets. So when I look at where time's being spent, I'm not just looking at the dollars and where money's being spent. I'm not just looking at the dollars. I'm also looking at my time, right? So let's take, for example, my nails. I calculated and really got surgical about how much time it takes for me to get my nails done. Every 2.5 weeks, about is what it is. The amount of drive time to get there, the amount of time it takes to do it. And yeah, I can be doing some other things, but I mean, these are your hands, so you have to get kind of creative if you're going to be on your computer or your phone, which, believe me, I do. But let's just say you're not doing that too. Or it's not maybe the highest use of your time to try and, text with one hand or listen or type or look at a report on your phone. So the amount of time to drive there, get my nails done, and drive home. Oh, it's a lot. I mean, every 2.5 weeks. Then what I did, and yes, it's easy to calculate how much money that costs in terms of what you're spending to get that service done. Okay, so do that. Then when we assign a value to our hours, which I think this is such a great way to get real with data, to start real with reality and look at the data, to start making decisions based on your value of your time. It becomes quicker to decide where I'm going to allocate and where I'm not when I think of it in terms of like an hourly rate, right? So sometimes I'll use, I've got my keynote fee, or I have potentially, like you can take your earnings, your net income for the whole year and divide it by, let's say 40 hours in a week if you want. Whatever you do to calculate your hourly value, it doesn't mean that you build that every hour last year necessarily, but you can arrive at a number. Then you start kind of realizing, so if I choose this instead of this, I'm giving up this amount of time. And if this is a frequent thing that's ongoing, a standing date at the nail salon, then I'm actually potentially sacrificing X amount of money. And maybe that's okay. And that's great. And you know what? Totally cool. However, that for me was a big eye opener because it was a big number. And it's like, it makes me think twice. So what do? I go out and I start researching every single type of other ways to get my nails done, meaning like all the new, over the counter things, all of the, the best. There are millions of them out there. And I start kind of almost like taste testing. And so that's an episode for another day. But we're talking well into 5 figures are being saved just by making that adjustment. And that makes me happy because it makes me realize, okay, I've got that extra time that I can allocate elsewhere. And maybe it's to read a book and maybe it's to focus on deep work things or whatever. And I've also got extra money. So I could invest that in XYZ. And so now we're looking at what was a depreciating asset, my nails, that depreciate every 2.5 weeks, to still get my nails done because I'm just getting resourceful, but I'm actually able to invest now. That's an appreciating. That's something that can have, compounded interest if I invest it. Or maybe I want to invest in someone's company, or just maybe it's just in savings. It could be, it could be purchasing something else too. It doesn't have to be an investment, but we have optionality now and opportunities, and that's exciting to me. Okay. Now, when I look at and I think about budget, and this is from my personal experience over this last year, Richard and I have literally every line item and everything spent personally mapped out every single month. And we look at it and we look at the change over time. And what it does for me in terms of, it gives me a sense of confidence and perceived control that allows me to make decisions a little differently. So we talk about bandwidth versus capacity, and time and money are related in my experience. We make certain decisions based on how we feel and how confident we feel in our financial situation. So we may choose decisions that are going to increase our capacity more when we feel more financial freedom or just more flexibility, more perceived control. But if we are in a scarcity mindset and we are concerned or stressed or have fear around money, then we are likely to be trying to do more to generate more. And that starts to look at the bandwidth tapping and trapping. And so this is also tightly correlated. And it kind of comes down to, I'm going to get back to the budget in a minute, because I hadn't necessarily done that consistently over time. Just kind of started earning more money and then didn't really look at things as closely as maybe I would have liked, and or ways to leverage things as much. And yes, I have an amazing financial advisor. And when it comes to kind of your traditional investments, those things are being blocked and tackled. But when it comes to my spending and just ability to save and invest more or allocate differently or leverage things differently, the light bulb started coming on. Like, it's amazing what you can find. So I'm going to pause. I'm going to bookmark that for a second. Back to our relationship with money. So we all have money stories. And I probably should have started this episode with that topic. And if you've ever heard me give a keynote, I'm often referring to my money story and how it's changed over time, over the last decade. And, I used to have this calculus, and a lot of times the calculus systemically comes from how we were brought up, or maybe what we saw or what we believe to be true. That can all change. You can rewrite that money story, but you have to be willing to look at what's inside, where that came from, but also your current data, and make friends with reality. And I think a lot of times, especially with money, we just kind of want to put our head in the sand and just try and earn more and maybe spend less and just kind of give it, almost flirt with the idea, versus diving in and getting super intimate with the facts, with the data, with the reality. And that's when it gets super fun in my experience, because the red pen comes out And it's so fun to save money. Okay, so, and if we start thinking of time as money, money is time, but it's not just one-to-one. It's you save time and you're up here in capacity and you're applying more time in that capacity. It's exponential impact to money, right? So back to the money story. My calculus was sacrifice equals success and success equals money. And I just thought the more we sacrificed, the more success we would have. And I'm sure some of this was from my upbringing. My family, my father specifically worked extremely hard. He sacrificed a ton and did very well, but we started with very humble beginnings, and they saved and they made their stock payments, and I watched him sacrifice, and I watched then, what happened from that. And in my mind, sacrifice equals success, success equals money. And so, therefore, this is what got me into trouble, especially that first 10, 15 years of my career. Sacrifice might be sacrificing sleep to work, which then, in my mind, the calculus was I make more money because I'm working harder, right? Working more, working harder is equivalent to the output of more money. You could argue that to a certain extent, heck yes, I've seen it, I've felt it. However, that is not what I subscribe to anymore, because there is a definite, not only point of diminishing returns, and you box yourself in because you're not thinking big enough, you're not growing necessarily, or giving yourself time to operate at capacity, but you are also looking at the one equals the other. And actually, there came a point in my life where it became the reverse. I thought the calculus was this way, but it was actually more of a liability, right? Of course, that makes sense. So, and for me, it was a recipe for burnout, right? What I realized is I'm actually not as financially motivated as I thought. And to me, success is directly correlated to freedom. And that doesn't mean you need endless amounts of money per se, right? So freedom meaning peace of mind, freedom to do and work and be and play when, where, how I want, with who I want type thing. And I'm not Pollyanna, but I value freedom to make certain decisions and optionality greater, and geographic freedom too, by the way, map freedom, greater than a certain number or like financial motivation per se. So, or certain things, like I'm just not a super material person. I've never really cared what kind of car I drive. However, there's nothing wrong with that if that's what makes you happy. It's just, I've always been a little more, and I'll be honest, extrinsically motivated by recognition, by, feeling a sense of I'm growing, and maybe more, perceived freedom that really wasn't there because the time budget wasn't as free as maybe I would have liked to think. So I had to really recalibrate that. What I started to do is realize, okay, if I'm more at capacity and doing what I'm uniquely qualified to do, there's a scarcity up there that I have a solution for, that people are willing to pay a premium for. So that means I could be spending 1 hour here and make X, or I could be spending potentially 5, 6, 7 hours here and make the same amount. So we have to really look at do we know what capacity looks like for ourselves? Because that's earning potential, right? That's, I always talk about where purpose, passion, and skill collide, bliss resides. That's what you're uniquely qualified to do. We want to be in that intersection. That's the Venn diagram. That's where income resides, and impact and joy and health usually, and all the good things. But if we are just focused on, skills, and we're not looking at purpose or passion, that's usually not going to be sustainable. We need all three in order to sustain droughts where maybe our passion isn't as high, or we're not feeling as much purpose, but we've got the other two. So we want to look at this as like a true, these are contributing factors to that sweet spot. So when I really started to notice this was, so if I'm able to earn more up here, I'm also able then to save and invest more. And it becomes this kind of snowball effect of, it might have taken a lot of bravery to open up that capacity. And we had to manufacture that bravery, which in my opinion, that's the why not now way. That's the renegade mentality. And there are 5 renegade rules, which I can recap at the end of this episode in terms of how to unlock more bravery, more potential in our genetic code and fly higher. But if we're playing it safe and we're in constant struggle and we're tapped at that bandwidth because we're trying to do it all to save money from not having anyone else do something, or do too much because we think doing more generates more money, then that's not a good mathematical problem. Like, that's not good math. It didn't calculate for me, at least, right? And there's actually a financial liability to that. So sometimes resourcefulness is just as powerful, if not more powerful, than resources. And so when we look at, our influence, and I'm not using that in terms of our Instagram influencers. What I'm looking at as, the more we're at capacity, the more doors open for more influence, more impact, more ability to access, I'll call it power. So these are board seats, these are stages, these are cap tables, these are investment opportunities. That's the game changer. Is our influence being allocated in places that will help it grow and actually make a bigger impact, not only for ourselves, but for others? That was a big aha for me. And that's leverage. That's leverage. Can we pool our influence together in a place where it's being used as leverage for other opportunities or for our capacity to shine more, versus we're so distracted and so fragmented at bandwidth that there's no influence. You're not influencing anything other than your own stress levels. That takes space. So that may mean making some tough decisions. Decisions like, okay, I have this income coming in and it's using this much bandwidth. But if I removed that and I actually was super brave and knew, okay, calculate, I could let go of that for a while if I actually turn this on and use that time up here, it would have an exponential more return. So my earning potential is that much higher if I make that shift, that it's worth that decision. And usually there are ways to test this, right? Can we pause this line item on, the P&L or this revenue stream, so on and so forth, and focus more on this and see what happens over time? Or can we parallel it just enough without being tapped at bandwidth to see if, yes, let's lean harder up here to whatever we're doing to be able to generate more? So the point is that it takes space and it takes bravery to be able to experiment sometimes what's going to actually be the best and the highest use of my time, because you can't really do that unless you have time. So there is there's a give and take here. And the more perceived, just influence and control you have over your current financial situation gives you more space and more just, again, bravery versus fear, that you have the margin to be able to experiment and fly higher, per se. So the other thing I just want to talk about is, there might be ways to leverage to save a lot more money than you realize too. And this is getting into the weeds, right? We want to get our hands dirty, understand all those subscriptions, let's say, that we've been paying for. Maybe they're apps, or maybe they're things that we haven't really been using, but it's just draining every month, little by little, that adds up over time. those types of things. We want to identify them, right? We want to bucket those. But also, one thing that I know has been really valuable and has paid dividends over the last 7, 8, maybe 9 years is points, using points and leveraging points for things that even sometimes big expenditures that can be paid for in a certain way in order to gain and accrue points, travel points specifically. So flights and hotels are something that it's been fascinating to see how much this has paid off over time. So if you are the type of person who doesn't have a tendency to overspend with credit cards, I am of the wiring that you pay them off every month, right? And that is important because just like we talked about like time and energy drains and tabs that are open and they kind of leak and they're being used, even though you're not focused on whether it's tabs on your computer or things you're ruminating on in your mind that's just draining energy, even if you're not intentionally having that happen. Same with debt, in my opinion. It is just this open tab, this engine that's being used, and it's just not only that, but obviously interest. So don't use this strategy if you have challenges with credit cards and managing them and so on and so forth, being responsible. When you start using credit cards to your advantage and paying them off, it's amazing how much you can accrue for value in terms of points. And that's credit. That's real. Those are real dollars that can be applied toward flights, toward hotels. And that's really cool because in a way, your money is working harder for you, right? And so we have a whole system for that, but there are big expenses that you probably don't realize you can use a credit card for, pay it right off. But you get, that value in terms of the equivalency of X amount of dollars toward travel. That has been fun to watch because all of a sudden you realize, okay, I can take a vacation now and not necessarily be spending what I would have had to allocate before. But if this money's going out the door, let's have it work harder for me than just the one-to-one, right? It's like I always try to get around or help people think through a different way to operate, a different economic model beyond trading time for dollars. And at the end of the day, yes, you could net that out, but is there a way in terms of like the type, if you have a service you offer or whatever it is you're doing, you could calculate your revenue, your net income, let's say, personally against the hours that you worked. And yes, that's trading time for dollars to a certain extent. Of course, there's usually a smarter way to look at that, whether that means productizing your value, your intellectual property, your IP, or finding a way to scale that, or, even potentially, we hear about mailbox money, invest differently to where at least you're finding a way to have that money work harder for you, or you're able to generate at an exponential return in terms of the allocation of time to dollars, right? You're able to shift that multiple and increase that multiple up. But it's kind of a conversation for another day. And I know we've talked a lot about that on this podcast before, about productizing IP and finding different ways to generate money or look at your economic model differently and shift it in a way that will allow you to earn more and to fly higher. And that's still based on the same expertise that maybe you were using before. It's distributed in a different way, maybe to more people or at a higher premium, so on and so forth. Okay, so we really want to just kind of look at those leverage points. We want to look at where our time is being spent and how it's impacting our earning potential and or our current net income, because net matters, right? Not just our gross income, but truly what are those expenses? Can we change those? So there's a lot of ways to manipulate bandwidth if you feel like you're at bandwidth. So let me review the 5 Renegade rules because these apply to this entire series. And if you are new to the podcast, then what I can share with you is that over the last more than 300 episodes and years of podcasting and inviting incredible minds onto the show, these guests are so diverse in terms of their intellectual capital and experience and just the way that their brains work, but also the industries and where they come from and all the things, extremely diverse. But as I've listened over the course of the years, and we're talking, you add this data to, more than 300 plus hours of interviewing, but also to my career in working with a lot of these individuals hands-on, front row seat. What I've realized is there are 5 things that most individuals do who are operating at capacity and continue to elevate and fly higher, and how they get from idea to action, and that bridge, that closing of the delta between idea and action, dreaming to doing. There are 5 similarities, things that I constantly hear when I ask, hey, tell me about a time when you had to ask yourself, why not now? And you went from idea to action. So over the course of all this data, as I distill it down and start to look at the trends, these are the things that I've learned. And this really makes up that renegade mentality. Now, every guest didn't necessarily say verbatim, I do XYZ, but they basically were describing a similar approach or philosophy. And what I'm interested in is that living and flying higher at capacity, because that's where joy and income and impact and health and a lot of things reside. And being in alignment, right? So those 5 things, what are the 5 renegade rules? Number 1, renegades identify the worst case scenario. And we don't do this because we're pessimists. We actually do it because we're very strategic. And what that does is it allows us to be operating from a place of logic and pragmatic information, default versus fear, right? So all of a sudden we're at the wheel with a logical mind versus fear, which is in the back seat. And so how do we arrive at the worst case scenario? First, we say, okay, what if this idea doesn't work? This why not now idea. So let's take, for the relevancy to this episode and this concept, what if we're considering letting go of this that was creating a lot of bandwidth and also generating some income in order to gain this, which could be a much higher return? Well, what if that doesn't work? So we want to answer that question and then say, then what? And answer that question and say, then what? Then what? Then what? And when we go through that process, 2 things happen. 1, we realize it's going to take longer than we thought to arrive at that worst case scenario, right? Because first you just start with, what if it doesn't work? That's not necessarily the worst case scenario. Usually it's not. There will be enough time to change, to pivot, to take out some insurance, to, adjust. And that isn't necessarily what enters our mind when we first think of this idea, right? That takes logic. Number 2, we realize, okay, this is safe enough to try. Just get started, right? So we're putting logic in the driver's seat and we're getting very real with if this, then that, and how we can adjust. It's going to take longer than we think. Number 2, the renegade rule number 2 is, it's my favorite one. Renegades don't give themselves an out. Okay, what does that mean? That means we put a mechanism in place to hold ourselves accountable, right? So that could be as simple as telling someone you're going to do something so they will hold you accountable. It could be sending a text to someone. It could be scheduling a meeting with someone that you need to have a critical conversation with in order to green light your idea, right? So we're just wanting to get momentum. We're wanting to take that first, best, brave step. And it's almost like intentionally putting ourselves against the wall. So the only way forward is by taking action across that starting line, right? So there's a line, a quote by Julius Caesar. He said, if you want to take the island, you burn your boat. So we want to burn our boat, not give ourselves an out. It could be buy the ticket schedule the meeting. Like I said, send the text, share on social media that you're going to do something that will hold you accountable. So that's Renegade rule number 2. Renegade rule number 3, renegades leverage adversity. What does that mean? That means we don't just make lemonade out of lemons. We actually use adversity as a springboard. Adversity is really an asset in disguise. And so adversity usually comes into our lives in the form of our finances, our health, our relationships, and our careers. If you don't really have a why not now idea, look around in those places and reverse engineer. You'll probably find one. So we look at adversity as a gift, as an asset that can be leveraged into where we want to go, right? It's really an asset. Renegade rule number 4 is renegades are hyper aware of our mental, physical, and emotional state. Okay, what does that mean, right? So again, we are becoming friends with reality, with the data, and all of this is physiological. If you think about, our physical reaction to hearing an idea, to being at bandwidth, and literally our heart's racing and our nervous system is just bonkers, that's a physiological cue. That's data that we might need to make some adjustments, right? This is our internal GPS. This is our self-talk. We're listening to it. It doesn't mean it's true, but making note because it might need to be adjusted. And so this is strategic. This isn't just, woo-woo per se. Mental, physical, and emotional state. When you hear something or when you're operating at a certain capacity, how do you feel? How does it feel to be here in your zone of genius where purpose, passion, and skill collide versus you can't even think straight because you're so busy and you're exhausted, right? That's how you would apply Renegade rule number 4. It doesn't mean we're in control of it, but we're aware. Mental, physical, and emotional state. Renegade rule number 5, this is the biggie. Renegades have operating and belief systems that are in sync. So that means operating system, this is your OS, just like our devices have an operating system that need to be updated. Our computers, our phones, they all need to have their OS, that system updated. We do too. So our operating system is literally how we navigate our day, our meetings, our time, our mornings, all of these logistical functions of tangible things in our day. That's our operating system. Our health, our sleep, that's our system, right? Our belief system is something greater than ourselves. This is the governing body of how you lead and live your life. This could be your why, your mission, your vision, whatever you want to call it. It's something usually bigger than yourself. And this is your big picture. This is your forest through the trees. So we have these two systems in sync and we can toggle back and forth all day, every day. And people who are living and increasing their capacity, in my experience, they are able to go back and forth quickly between doing and looking at the bigger picture of the strategy and the vision and where they're headed. So their capacity. And when we talk about like rolling up our sleeves and getting things done, people who are operating capacity still have to do that, right? It's just what things. It's the specific things. So the operating system and the belief system have to be so tightly toggled back and forth that we never really lose track of where we're headed, but also we have to keep our eye on those details that matter, right? Even if you're spending time deep work writing, you have to stay on track. You have to actually do it. So the vision and the action, they have to be in sync, and we have to be able to go from one to the other quickly, right? So that is a recap of the 5 Renegade rules, which is the Renegade mentality, which is an operating system. It's a daily practice. It's how I've been living my life for many, many years. And it's how, very similar to some of the people that I have the most respect for who are operating at capacity and continuing to push higher. the types of things they're doing as well while staying in alignment. And nobody's perfect, but those are governing principles of how I do lead my life. And so when we look at the tactics, it applies to all 3 episodes in this series. And hopefully you found value in the series. I'm excited to explore this more with everyone, and let me know how you feel about it, what you think, if you have ideas, if you have questions, you have comments. If you're listening right now, know you can go to YouTube and watch this. If you are watching here, know you have options on Spotify and Apple Podcasts and everywhere else you like to listen. So head to amyjomartin.com. If you want to sign up for my emails where I provide additional resources for all these types of things, it's exciting. I have a healthy obsession with this concept of increasing capacity and really managing and optimizing bandwidth. So I look forward to next time, and thank you for listening.